Snow came down in shards that night, slanting like thrown knives under the howling breath of a Wyoming winter. Folks in Red Creek knew better than to be out past dusk when the wind turned mean. But somewhere beyond the hush of lanterns and boarded windows, a girl was running barefoot into the drifts. Her name was Elsie Morrow, though by dawn she'd have no name to speak of, only the whisper of her father's rage, and the weight of a wedding dress turned ragged by brambles and ice. Her veil had tangled in a mesquite branch half a mile back. Her shoes, soft satin slippers, were lost when she slipped down the creek bed. The hem of her dress slapped at her knees, soaked through with meltwater and blood from where thorn bushes had torn the silk and her skin alike. Elsie's breath came ragged in the dark. She could taste iron at the back of her throat. Her cheeks burned raw where tears met the bite of the wind. Behind her, the faint orange smudge of the Morrow Ranch flickered in and out of the storm, lanterns bobbing as men stumbled after her with hoarse shouts that scattered into the gusts. They would find the rope still dangling from the big elm behind the smokehouse, a noose knotted from bridal lace. They'd say she'd shamed the family. They'd swear she betrayed her vows before they were spoken. They'd brand her witch, harlot, traitor to her blood. Her father's voice carried on that storm like a curse. Elsie kept running. The snow took her ankles, first bright pain, then numbness. She tripped twice, caught herself on bramble and sage. She pressed her palms to the ground once to stand, and left 2 bloody prints on the white, small enough that a child might have made them. The sky cracked open once with distant thunder, though the cold gave no rain, just more snow, heavy and clean. She didn't know where she was going, only away. Away from the man waiting at the altar with whiskey on his breath and a wedding band heavy in his fist. Away from the barn door that slammed shut behind her mother's sob. Away from the rope she'd undone herself, trembling fingers picking lace apart while the world slept. When she fell again, she stayed down, ribs heaving, vision swimming black at the edges. The hush of the storm turned gentle for half a breath, as if even the wind pitied her. That's when she felt him. The quiet shift of weight through the snow, not boots crunching but soft moccasins pressing down, step by step. A shape blocked the wind, dark against the swirl of white. She tried to rise, but her elbows gave way. The snow opened its arms and took her. Then warmth. A coarse wool blanket draped over her shoulders, rough with old smoke and sage. A hand pressed to her back, not to hold her down but to steady her shivering. He said nothing. His breath fogged in the moonlight. Black hair tied back, a face weathered like the mesas south of the pass. Eyes that held her for a moment, seeing but not demanding. Elsie's lips cracked when she tried to speak. No words came, just a raw sob that tasted of blood and frost. The Navajo crouched beside her, wrapped her tighter, and lifted her up as if she weighed no more than a sack of corn. She flinched when his arm brushed her wrists, rope burns bright and raw under the lace cuffs, but he did not pry. He turned from the ranch lights and stepped into the deeper dark of the timberline, carrying her heartbeat like a secret against his chest. Somewhere behind them, the wind smothered the last flicker of lantern flame. Elsie buried her face in the scratch of his blanket and let the snow swallow her tracks. The timberline took them in like a mouth closing over a secret. Pines stood ancient and dark, their spines bristling with snow, branches sighing beneath the storm's soft weight. The cold here was a quieter thing, not gone, but softened by bark and boughs that blocked the wind's worst edges. He moved with a grace that startled her, even through half-conscious shivers. Each step sank soundless into the drift. His moccasins left shallow marks that the snow fell back to hide. Now and then he paused to shift her weight, never once dropping her, though her wet skirts tangled around his legs and her head lolled against his shoulder. She could hear his heartbeat steady, low as a drum buried in earth. Elsie's mind fluttered in and out. She saw scraps of her own hands, blood crusted under fingernails. Raw rope burns at her wrists like bracelets of fire. She smelled pine pitch, animal musk, the faint dry sweetness of sage, tucked somewhere in the folds of his blanket. Above, the wind combed through the trees, whispering things only the oldest trunks remembered. She wondered what name he carried, this man whose silence was kinder than any word spoken to her that day. Maybe he was one of the old families from the far mesas, people her father's kind cursed in whiskey whispers when cattle went missing or wells ran dry. Maybe he was a ghost, or a punishment for running when a daughter's place was to kneel and bear it. He shrugged, slow and sure, as if the wind itself might understand better than she did. He flicked a glance to the noose of shame she still wore in the raw rings around her wrists. Easy to tie, hard to break. She stared at the fire until the flames blurred. The world behind her, the vows, the threats, the white dress that mocked her in scraps, all of it felt like a snake she'd skinned but hadn't buried yet. Outside the circle of warmth, snow still fell, burying her footprints deeper, hiding the trail men would follow come daylight. She wondered if they'd find her before the dawn. If they did, would Tahoudin stand between her and the rope? She didn't know. She didn't ask. Instead, she pulled the blanket tight around her shoulders and leaned closer to the warmth that asked nothing in return. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called once soft, like a promise that the night still had room for those willing to run. The fire fought the night for hours, snapping and spitting sparks into the hush of the timberline. Elsie drifted in and out, her body giving up what heat it had hoarded in shallow, shivering sleep. She woke once to the sound of Tahoudin's breath, a slow rhythm above the wind's restless sighs. He had not laid down to rest. He crouched near the embers, feeding dry twigs into the glow, eyes half-lidded but open, always scanning the dark. His blanket now lay half across her shoulders and half wrapped around his own back. Where it met at her hip, she felt the living proof of him, warmth that stayed, even when she trembled. Dawn came grudgingly, leaking through the treetops in a thin milk wash of light. The storm had eased its tantrum but left behind its teeth drifts knee-high, crusted with ice, branches bent under the weight. She sat up, wincing, as blood rushed back into her frozen feet, and pulled the blanket tighter. Tahoudin noticed. He rose from his crouch and moved through the snow without a word. She heard the soft crunch of his moccasins as he circled the clearing, studying the edge where pine shadows met the pale sprawl of open country. He paused at a spot near a fallen log, knelt, and brushed snow aside until the ground showed the faint indent of a boot print. A man's boot, heavy heel, not his. Elsie felt the cold wrap her throat again, not the kind that snow brings but the kind her father's voice had left behind. She looked at the print and then at Tahoudin. He didn't flinch. He pressed his palm into the track as if feeling for its heartbeat, then brushed pine needles over it until it vanished back into the hush. He came back to the fire, crouched, and looked her full in the face, the first time she felt the weight of his eyes truly hold her there. "They'll come?" she asked, voice raw. He didn't nod, didn't shrug, just looked, as if to say, "What do you think the world does when a rope goes empty?" Elsie's fingers curled into fists under the blanket. The knot of her wedding dress, now just ragged silk at her collarbone, shifted when she breathed. She caught a glimpse of her reflection in a sliver of ice near the fire, hair wild, cheeks bruised by wind and fear, eyes that looked more alive than they'd ever dared in her father's house. She pulled the lace scrap from her sleeve, the last piece of the noose they'd meant for her neck. She held it to the flame. Tahoudin watched, but did not stop her. The lace curled and blackened. Smoke rose sharp and sweet with old perfume and bridal powder. When it crumbled to ash in the snow, Elsie felt the weight of it shift inside her chest. Not gone, not forgiven, but burned down to something she could name. Tahoudin spoke then, voiced the low rasp of boot leather on dry trail. "North," he said, flicking his chin toward the rise of land where pine gave way to rock and wind. "No Prince Keep." She understood. The open prairie would betray them, snow crusted hard enough for men and dogs to follow. But the ridges north, the stone spines and creeks tangled like old scars, might swallow their trail the way the storm had swallowed her footprints last night. She pushed herself up, legs trembling. He steadied her with a hand at her elbow, no more, no less. They packed what little he carried: dried meat, his old blanket, a bone-handled knife that glinted once when the light caught its edge. As they moved beyond the last flicker of their fire, Elsie glanced back, saw the charred scrap of lace, the bed of cedar boughs pressed flat by her sleep, the smoke threading up to the waking sky. A piece of her past burned there, but the rope still lived in the bruises around her wrists. She would carry the scars. She would choose how they healed. When Tahoudin turned to lead her deeper into the ridges, she followed barefoot in borrowed warmth. Every step a promise the noose would never find her neck again. They climbed the ridge at dawn's broken edge, where the land rose in ribs of stone and pine clung to the rock like stubborn ghosts. The snow here lay thin in places, scraped raw by wind. Elsie's feet, wrapped now in scraps of cloth torn from her ruined dress, slipped and bled on sharp shale, but she did not complain. Tahoudine moved ahead of her, pausing when her breath hitched, offering a steady arm and nothing more. Behind them, Red Creek stirred awake. Riders would saddle up, men with the Morrow name on their lips and iron in their holsters, trailing dogs and old grudges. A girl didn't run from a wedding without someone deciding she needed dragging back or burying quiet under winter's hush. Tahoudine knew this. So did Elsie. It was stitched into the wind that hissed through the spruce. By midday, they reached an outcrop stone stacked like steps to the sky, a shallow ledge hidden from the prairie below. Tahoudine knelt, brushing aside old pine needles, revealing a hollow where he stashed dry kindling and a scrap of oilskin. He'd used this place before. She could see it in the way his shoulders eased when they ducked beneath the rock's overhang. She sank onto the stone, pulling her feet up under the blanket. Her skin was mottled purple where the cold had gnawed at it. Tahoudine lit a small fire no bigger than his palm and laid a handful of dried sage over the flame. The smoke curled thick and fragrant, masking their scent, trickling upward through the cracks in the stone. "Why help me?" she asked, voice muffled by the blanket. He didn't look up from the fire. He sliced a strip of jerky with his bone knife, handed it to her, then spoke slow, as if each word weighed more than the last. "Your father took this ridge once, pushed my kin off it, paid men to burn huts, poison wells. Same rope." She stared. The sage smoke stung her eyes. Or maybe that was the truth of what he'd said. Same rope, not just cloth and knot, but power threaded through land and name. She wondered how many girls like her had run barefoot into storms. How many had been dragged back before they found a fire and a man too silent to judge. The hush between them cracked when a snap of twig cut through the drifting snow outside the hollow. Tahoudine's head turned. Sharp as a wolf's blanks, he killed the fire with a handful of dirt, pressed a finger to his lips, then eased forward to the mouth of their shelter. Elsie heard them before she saw them, two voices drifting up the slope, men half laughing, half cursing the cold. Boots crushed snow. A dog's collar jingled faintly. One voice carried her father's sneer in its shape, a hired man named Calhoun, who'd once pressed his palm to her back in the barn. Too friendly for a man with a ring on his finger. She held her breath as Tahoudine shifted his knife to his palm. The blade caught a fleck of light. He leaned out, checked the angle of the ridge. The men were close, too close to slip away, too loud to pretend the snow would swallow them in time. A dog barked once, sharp, hungry, the scratch of claws on stone. The men laughed low, Boots scuffing at the base of the ledge. One spit a curse at the mutt. Elsie's heart thudded so hard she thought they'd hear it echo off the rock. Then a small defiance, a thing so slight she nearly wept for it. The dog, a lean hound with ribs like a broken fence, sniffed the smoke, found the faint trail of human warmth, then froze. His ears pricked. One man barked his name, "Jed, here, boy." But the hound turned, hackles bristling, and refused. A low growl rumbled from his ribs. He stayed rooted where he was, blocking the narrow path up to their hollow, his belly to the snow. One man cursed again, kicked snow at the mutt's flank. But the dog did not move. He planted himself like an old pine root and growled until the men, too cold and too sure of themselves, spat and turned back down the slope, Boots fading into the hush. Tahoudine waited until the crunch of snow was gone. He touched the stone beside Elsie, knuckles brushing her knee, not a promise but a question. "Still with me?" She nodded. For the first time, she smiled, raw and cracked but real. The rope would follow, but so would a crack in its hold. They stayed under the ridge until the sun began its slow dive behind the granite teeth of the mountains. When the light shifted from cold white to bleeding orange, Tahoudine motioned for her to stand. He'd already packed what little they had, a strip of jerky, the last coil of sage, ashes scattered beneath a cover of pine needles. No trace left, except the dog's refusal to betray them. Elsie rose on legs that trembled but did not fail her. She leaned on the rock, grit biting her palms. Her feet throbbed where stone and ice had split the skin. Tahoudine crouched beside her, unwrapped a strip of deerskin from his pouch, and began binding her left foot, then the right, rough hands steady as river stones. He didn't speak, but when he finished, he tapped her ankle once. A silent promise, "We go." They moved west along the ridge, climbing where stone rose in jagged ledges, slipping through slots of spruce and frozen creek beds that would confuse any tracker not born to this land. Below them, the prairie stretched endless, a white sheet waiting for boot prints that would never come. Elsie watched Tahodine's back as he led her, the way his shoulders rolled with each step, how he paused at each crest to scan the wind. There was purpose in him, carved deep under the quiet. She'd grown up believing men were loud when they wanted something, a voice that rattled doors, hands that left bruises like signatures. But this man spoke with silence, and his silence said, "Stay alive. Keep moving." When dusk swallowed the last rim of sun, they reached a hollow tucked behind a stand of old aspen. The bark shimmered pale as bone under the moon's first glance. There, under the bent trunk of a lightning-scarred pine, Tahodine brushed aside snow to reveal the black mouth of an old badger den, widened long ago by hands like his. Inside, it was dry earth and the lingering scent of old fires. Elsie crawled in, pressing her back to the cool dirt wall. She felt the earth cradle her bruises. She felt the rope burns itch like they wanted to speak. She ignored them. Tahodine built a tiny fire, no bigger than his palm, cupped by stones to hide its glow. He slipped a sliver of meat over the flame, handed it to her first. She ate it slow, mouth raw from days of wind and salt. When she was done, he tossed her the last scrap and she split it in two, pressing half into his palm without a word. He looked at her for a long moment before he took it. Outside, coyotes yipped at the stars, somewhere to the east. A shot cracked the cold far off, distant as a memory. The rope hadn't given up yet. She felt it trailing them in the dark. She watched Tahodine as he checked the den's mouth, scraping snow to mask their trail. The blade of his bone-handled knife caught moonlight in sharp glances. He moved like someone used to sleeping with one ear open, a man who knew the taste of betrayal long before she stumbled barefoot into his arms. She thought of the rope again, how easy it was to tie, how hard to burn. The lace scrap she'd fed to the flame still clung to her thoughts, ash in her veins. "Why didn't you run too?" she asked, voice just above the fire's hiss. Tahodine didn't turn. He pressed his palm to the low roof of the den, feeling for leaks, for signs of eyes where none should be. His answer came slow, a ghost riding the wind between them. "I did," he said. That was all. He didn't owe her the rest. She saw it anyway in the scar by his mouth, in the way he crouched with his back to her, never quite at ease. A man who'd run once, maybe twice, maybe forever. The fire flickered low, throwing shadows on the packed earth. Elsie shifted closer, careful of her feet, careful of the raw skin at her wrists. She laid her hand on the ground, between them, not touching him, not asking to. Just there, an offering to the hush. Above them, snow began to whisper again, thin flakes drifting through the half-hidden mouth of the den. The rope pulled at her memory, a father's hand, a preacher's lie, the noose that promised her silence. She closed her eyes and let the snow bury that promise, inch by inch. The snow didn't last the night. A warm wind slithered in from the west, not kind enough to thaw her frozen bones, but cruel enough to melt their hidden cover. By dawn, the white crust that blanketed the badger den's mouth had turned to slush, trickling in cold drips down the packed dirt walls. Elsie woke to the sound of meltwater, the taste of damp earth on her tongue. Tahodine was already outside when she crawled into the pale dawn. He stood on the slope above the den, scanning the open belly of the ridge. His breath fogged soft and steady. She watched him stand so still that even the crows ignored him, hopping branch to branch, as if he were just another crooked pine holding up the sky. Below them, the prairie sprawled in waves of gray and brown, where snow had given up its secrets. Footprints that had hidden under drifts now glared back at the world, a trail plain as a sentence waiting to be carried out. Elsie felt it in her gut, the rope uncoiling behind them, inching closer with every exposed print. Tahodine, crouched by a patch of thawed mud, pressed 2 fingers into the track. He frowned, just the smallest flicker of his eyes, but enough. He wiped the print with his palm, smudging it into a bruise of brown. Then he stood, looked down at her where she sat shivering under the weight of her ragged dress and borrowed blanket. "Men, come." She nodded. She didn't ask how many. Enough. One would have been too many. He motioned west, to where the ridge split open into a gash of ravine and scattered boulders. He said nothing else. She gathered what scraps of strength she had left, tucked the blanket tight around her shoulders, and limped after him. The ravine yawned wider with each step. Snow clung in patches under overhangs, mud squelched at her raw feet, soaking through the strips of deerskin Tahoudine had bound there. Her body wanted to give out, wanted to curl up under a root and sleep forever, but the memory of the rope burned hotter than her fear of the cold. At the mouth of the ravine, Tahoudine stopped. He pointed to a shallow cave, just a shadow under a lip of rock. He pressed her shoulder, guiding her inside, then crouched and pressed his bone knife into her palm. She shook her head, startled. "I can't." He closed her fingers around the hilt anyway. His thumb brushed the back of her hand. Not soft, but certain, the same way he'd tie a knot he trusted not to slip. "Quiet," he said, voice so low it was almost the wind. Elsie pressed her back to the cave wall, clutching the knife. She watched him slide back out into the wash of dawn, slipping behind a boulder near the trail they'd left like a trail of crumbs. She heard them before she saw them, hooves crunching old snow, spurs clinking like cold laughter. The men rode easy, voices cutting the hush. Calhoun's drawl floated above the rest, mean as a splinter. "Said she was barefoot, but I reckon even a bitch learns to crawl when she's cold enough. Found her tracks clear as day." Another voice, younger, nervous. "You think she's with that Navajo?" "The ranch hands say." Calhoun snorted. "Ranch hands say what they're paid to say. Her daddy wants her in a box, or on a leash, don't matter which." Elsie's throat closed around the bile that rose. She pressed her palm to the cave wall, felt the cold grit dig under her nails. The rope, the noose, the brand they wanted to carve into her, the shame they dragged back to town to hang from the big elm behind the smokehouse. A horse snorted close, so close she could see the flick of its ears through the crack in the stone. Calhoun's boots scraped rock. Then silence. So sudden her ears rang with it. She strained to hear over her own heartbeat. A grunt, a scuffle, the soft thump of flesh on cold stone. Then a hiss of breath. Tahoudine's shape shifted behind the boulder, blade flashing once in the dawn. One man went down hard. Another stumbled back, spitting curses that cracked the brittle air. Elsie gripped the knife, knuckles white. Her breath ghosted the cave wall. If they found her now, they'd bury the blade in her belly and drag her back by the hair. The thought tasted like iron. Outside, Calhoun's voice rose sharp. "There, I see him." Boots scrambled on stone. A gun barked once a crack that rattled the ravine. Another barked back Tahoudine's rifle this time, short and guttural. Elsie held the knife tighter. Her eyes flicked to the entrance, to the narrow break of sky above her. She thought of the rope, the wedding dress, the lace burned to ash by firelight. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the smell of blood, gunpowder, and pine. She pressed her free hand to the raw skin at her wrist. Same rope, but maybe this time she would cut it herself. The cave felt smaller with each heartbeat. Elsie's breath scraped her throat like sand. The bone knife dug a cold crescent into her palm. She pressed her back harder against the rock, but the stone gave no warmth, no comfort, only the promise that she could stay hidden and live, or step out and decide what her life was worth. Outside, the clash crackled like brush fire. Boots scuffled on shale. A horse shrieked and bolted, hooves scattering stones down the ravine. She heard Calhoun's voice spit curses, heard Tahoudine's grunt, the raw thud of bone on bone. No gun now, too close, too quick. Just breath and fists, and the rasp of a man's will scraping against another's propping. Elsie's mind flashed back to the barn, the hush before her father's boot kicked the stall door open, the slap that made her lips split, the taste of blood she swallowed because that was a daughter's place. She thought of the rope that brushed her throat when she touched it with trembling fingers that night. Thought of the way her father's voice cracked when she vanished into the snow. She pressed her thumb to the blade's edge. It bit her skin, sharp and sure. The scuffle shifted, a body slammed against the boulder near the cave. Tahoudine's voice, ragged, broke through the hush. "Run!" But Elsie did not run. She dropped to her knees, crawled forward on hands and bruised feet, until the mouth of the cave opened like a jagged tooth. She saw them then, Tahoudine and Calhoun tangled in the grit, snow-stained, rusty under them. Calhoun's fist slammed into Tahoudine's jaw, splitting skin. He snarled a curse, teeth bared, breath fogging in the raw dawn. Calhoun's eyes flicked up, caught her where she crouched like a fox in its den. His smile split his face. all teeth and triumph. "Well, there's my pretty bride." Tahoudin lunged, but Calhoun twisted, smashing an elbow into his throat. The impact cracked like a green branch breaking. Tahoudin fell back, breath lost to the cold. Elsie's heart slammed against her ribs. Her mind shouted run, but her legs refused. She gripped the knife so tight her wrist burned against the old rope scars. Calhoun stumbled toward her, boots slipping on rock. His hand reached out ringed, thick-knuckled, the same hand that once pushed her against barn walls when no one watched. "Come here, girl. Daddy's tired of waiting." He grabbed her hair. Pain shot down her neck, raw and bright. The cave behind her blurred. The sky above flickered like a dying lantern. Then the rope in her memory snapped. She drove the knife up, not clean, not skilled, just raw, desperate force. The bone hilt slammed her palm. The blade bit deep under his ribs, catching soft belly instead of muscle. He made a sound, not a roar, not a curse, just a wet grunt that froze in the cold air. Calhoun's eyes flicked wide. He staggered back. One hand pressed to the spreading dark at his gut. She scrambled out of the cave, bare feet skidding on slush. The knife clattered from her fingers, slick with heat that steamed in the dawn chill. Behind her, Tahoudin rose, slow but unyielding. He caught Calhoun's collar as the man tried to lurch away, half dragged by his own shock. Their eyes met the rancher's wide with disbelief, the Navajo's dark with something colder than the wind. Tahoudin did not raise the knife. He did not shout. He simply pushed Calhoun back a single, steady shove that sent the man's boots skidding over loose shale. The cliff's edge took him with the same hush the snow had given Elsie when she fled, a distant thud. Silence. Elsie dropped to her knees. The old scars on her wrists burned like they were new again. Blood on her palms, under her nails, a new brand but one she'd chosen. Tahoudin crouched beside her, touched her face with a thumb that smelled of iron and sage. Not to claim her, not to tame her, just to remind her, alive. Wind rose through the ravine, rattling the bare branches above. Somewhere far off, a crow screamed once, a sound like a nail driven into old wood. The echo lingered and died. Tahoudin took her shaking hand, lifted it so she could see the smear of red across her knuckles. "Yours now," he rasped. And though her breath sawed through her ribs, though her body trembled with the shock of it, Elsie nodded. The rope was still there, but she'd cut her piece of it free. The ravine held its silence after Calhoun's body vanished into the rocks below. The echo of his final grunt, the way the stone swallowed him whole, it lingered in Elsie's ears like a half-remembered hymn. She could taste metal on her tongue, feel the beat of her own heart, thunder under her collarbone like a drum that refused to slow. Tahoudin knelt beside her, where she crouched in the melt slush and grit. His palm rested on her back, not pushing, not pulling, just there, solid as the stone beneath their knees. A heartbeat ago, she'd been prey. A heartbeat later, she was something else. Not quite free, not quite safe, but unchained, if only for the moment. She could feel the rope at her wrists in phantom heat, but when she glanced down at her hands, it wasn't hemp or lace she saw, it was blood. Her blood. His blood. The stain she'd made herself. Tahoudin rose, moving like an old cedar bending in wind, deliberate and unhurried. He picked up the bone knife where she'd dropped it. He cleaned it on the snow, a careful ritual, slow circles until the steel caught no more red. Then he buried the blade up to its hilt in the frozen earth by the cave's mouth. Elsie watched him, confused at first until she understood. That knife was the rope's ghost, the thing that cut her free. He left it in the ground like a seed, a mark that said, "Something ended here. Let the earth eat the rest." When he finished, Tahoudin lifted his chin toward the slope where Calhoun had gone down. He gestured, "Come." She didn't want to stand. Her legs trembled like saplings in high wind, but she pushed herself up, bracing on the rock, every scrape of stone against her palms reminding her that the world was still real. Still hers, at least this ridge, this breath. They scrambled down the slope in silence. The dawn split wider, throwing sharp gold across the broken spines of granite and the wind-carved gullies below. When they reached the ledge where the body lay, half hidden among scrub and drifts of thawed snow, Elsie felt her stomach tighten, but she didn't look away. Calhoun's eyes were wide, staring at a sky he never thought would outlast him. His mouth was slack, a black smear where his teeth caught blood. She stood above him, Tahoudin at her side, and waited for guilt to come. It didn't. Instead, memory came. The barn door slamming, the rope behind the smokehouse, the taste of her father's threats on the back of her tongue. Calhoun was never the noose, just the hand that held it tighter. Tahoudin knelt first. He pulled the collar of the man's coat shut, covering the slack mouth. Then he dragged brush, snow, and stone, piling them over the body until the shape was no shape at all, just another broken patch of earth under the cold sun. Elsie stepped forward. She tugged the scrap of her torn bridal veil, the last corner she'd hidden in her pocket, out of sight when she'd burned the rest. She tucked it under the stones, not for Calhoun, but for the girl she'd been before the snow took her. No marker, no name, no sermon, just rocks and wind. They stood together in the hush, no words needed. The rope was buried here, with the man who carried it in his grin and his fists. But her wrists would bear the scar-thin red rings that would fade to white, a reminder every time she ran her thumb over them in the quiet. Tahoudin touched her elbow, a soft nudge that said enough. He led her back up the slope, away from the burial, away from the hush of a man who'd never speak again. At the ridgetop, they paused. The wind tore at her hair, lifted the edge of his blanket around her shoulders. For the first time since the snow took her feet bare into the night, Elsie let herself breathe all the way to her ribs. She looked at Tahoudin and saw not a ghost, not a savior, but a man with a scar and hands that built warmth where none should have been, a man who gave her silence and asked for nothing back. Below, the prairie waited, tracks already filled with drifting snow. Somewhere, her father still cursed the wind, but here, on this broken ridge, she'd left her noose behind in the dirt. Tahoudin turned west, always west, and she followed. They moved west for 3 days, crossing scrubland where the wind spoke in rattles, and the sky stretched so wide it felt like a mercy and a threat all at once. The cold clung to their boots at night, but the sun cracked open warmer each dawn. Spring had its claws in the earth, no matter how winter hissed its last curses behind them. Tahoudin guided them to a hollow tucked deep in the folds of the land, a dip sheltered by cottonwoods, and a spring that whispered under a crust of old snow. Once, long ago, his people kept a garden here. He told her this in 3 short words, spoken by the fire on the first night they settled in the hollow. Old corn ground. Elsie stood at the edge of the spring that morning, watching meltwater trickle through her cupped palms. She rubbed the raw skin at her wrists, the rope burns that still flared if she pressed too hard. They were healing into thin, white bands, soft but certain, a memory that no father, no preacher, no ranch hand would ever bury again. Tahoudin came beside her, carrying a small bundle wrapped in hide. He knelt in the thawed patch by the stream and peeled the hide back to reveal kernels dull gold, red as rust, some dark as river stones. Seed corn, saved from his grandmother's hand, he said, long before white men called this land theirs. Together they worked the soft patch of earth with their fingers. He showed her how to press each kernel into the damp soil, how to mound the dirt just so, how to hum low in the back of the throat so the birds wouldn't steal the promise before it rooted. His voice, so rare, rolled through her bones like a lullaby, meant for the dirt and the ghosts alike. When they finished, they sat back on their heels. The sun rode high, warm on their bowed heads. Between them lay a scatter of fresh-turned soil, and the first stake of a new claim, not the kind taken by bullet or rope, but by bare hands pressing hope into the ground. Elsie touched the edge of her wrist again, traced the scar like a line on a map she'd drawn herself. The rope lived there, but now so did the knife's ghost. The hush of the ravine, the crack of the branch that broke Calhoun's sneer, and here, under this hush of cottonwood and spring, the rope's shame had been buried deep enough to grow something else. That night, they built a fire so small it barely flickered past the ring of stones, but it was enough. Elsie laid her head on the blanket Tahoudin had first wrapped around her in the snow. Its rough weave still smelled faintly of smoke and sage. She did not dream of the wedding dress, nor the barn door, nor the rope. Instead, she dreamed of hands pressing seeds into soil, of water winding through dark roots, of a garden that might bloom where the world once carved her hollow. At dawn, she rose and carved a small sign into a piece of driftwood she found by the creek. Just her name, not Morrow, not a father's brand, just Elsie. She propped it by the garden's edge, where any wind could read it, where any passing bird might carry her name far past Red Creek. When she turned back, Tahoudine watched her with the quiet surety that needed no vow, no preacher, no rope to bind it. The scars would stay. So would the soil. So would the hush between two people who knew that sometimes surviving was the loudest defiance of all. In years to come, folks might whisper of the barefoot bride who vanished into snow. Some said she froze. Some said she begged forgiveness at her father's grave. But the wind would tell it truer if you cared to listen. That she knelt by an old spring, pressed seed to dirt with hands scarred clean, and chose to live where the rope could never reach her throat again. So hush now, keep this tale in your pocket like a smooth stone. When the rope finds your wrist, remember, it ties easy. Breaking it? That's the part you earn with blood and garden soil. If this story stirred your bones, hit subscribe and stay by the fire. More untold legends are waiting in the dark.